kids cover your ears.
We didn't know whether we should start a real games company or whether we should just go and find real jobs. We decided to give Darwinia a go. Now, we didn't take any money from publishers because we didn't want any publishers fucking up our games.
So I think what you just heard, and it was even a little bit quieter there, was the camel's back snapping right in front of you. All of the pent-up resentment from 2 decades of the movement away from that person-driven development into a massive katamari of tangled relationships amongst business titans who had no vested interest to anyone but their shareholders was now and forever going to change. Because concurrent to this, a number of other new people were onto something good. And they were all starting to crawl up from the underground like so many earthworms after the rain, and it was starting to make my job ferreting out novel ideas very, very easy. Here, 3 Carnegie Mellon students had just launched an initiative to promote fast prototyping of game concepts, which would result in a small handful of truly excellent ideas, including one about building stable structures from sentient little balls of goo. Here, a tiny student team from California had just proven themselves with a rapid-fire succession of games about making shapes from clouds, and had boiled academic theory from a man with a more or less unpronounceable name into an entirely digestible game that adjusted itself to your own level of aggression or serenity. Another set of students in Seattle had just designed a truly mind-bending game where you could place 2 sets of holes anywhere in the ceilings or walls or floors and then just walk right between them, before getting snapped up by a larger game developer who was starting to take this turn away from retail distribution pretty seriously. And at the same time, legend was growing of a guy whose name most of us hadn't really heard before, who was putting together a Mario-esque platformer where you could literally rewind and replay time if you fall into your death. And later, a forward-thinking art game show in Montreal had just debuted a low-res 5-minute game that let the player live out an entire lifetime from childhood to death from someone who, rumor had it, lived a bohemian life in the wilds of New York State. And so I could easily go on, not just from that era, but exponentially even more so in the years that followed. And when you tally the score, the total influx of these newcomers with entirely original ideas and aesthetics and approaches to play, it's at that point that you have to ask yourself, what changed? And sure, in large part, the changes lie in the network, not just the literal one that now digitally connects us all, but in the number of platform holders that opened up the floodgates to let you on, hoping to reap the rewards of your creativity both in monetary and credibility terms. But the even bigger revolution is in controlling not just the means of distribution, but the means of production as well. And it seems especially worth noting that it's not just that games have reached their Gutenberg stage. By far the most important thing that separates the new indie scene from their coder artist ancestors is that we've stumbled into the era of gaming Xerox, a stage where the maturity and ubiquity of the tools available to everyday people is staggering. Because it's literally never been easier for you to express the idea you've always wanted to express and get it to the hands of an audience. I can't be sure exactly what the makeup of the audience here is today, but if you've never even given thought of creating a game before, or work in this industry only tangentially related, now is the time to try your hand at giving us something new. So behind me here, Jim is playing, the work of students who had never touched code before, playing within the framework of breakout games, all of whom ended up creating something quite beautiful over like a weekend. It's pretty awesome. And for the rest of you that have been at this for some time, if you have found yourself spinning your wheels at a studio where you can't express yourself, or you found yourself on a path that's veered radically from where you thought it was going, there's never been a better time to take that terrifying leap of faith. So I've just spent the past 15, 20 minutes here talking about me, talking about a bunch of people that aren't even here right now, all generally kind of higher level stuff. And since we've got the entire weekend to get more practical advice from people that actually make their living making games, you might still be getting sort of hungry for something you can bring back home with you, so I want to stop and focus on you. And what I want you to get out of this, or at least hope that you might, Kurt Vonnegut liked to say that his only advice for young writers was don't use semicolons. And I'm afraid I'm going to give you something that's kind of just as glib. Just be yourself. 3 words boiled down to kind of schmaltzy retro cliche. But what surprises me is just how hard an idea this is to find in today's game culture. I've said this before elsewhere, but during my time at Gamasutra, I was shocked to discover what a dearth of original inspiration existed in the wider industry, with a regular column we did that asked developers what they were reading and listening to and watching. Because 9 times out of 10, this is what came back, the same sources of inspiration. They were watching Star Wars, they were watching Lord of the Rings, or any sci-fi fantasy hit of the day. And I don't think it's any great leap to see where that's taken us as a medium. We've got this stagnation where games are continually about this guy over and over again. And I also like to say that it's a problem where even now in 2010, we're taking the absolutely amazing capacity of this art form that can express mystery, or surreality, or humanity, that can express anything we can possibly imagine, and too often we're reducing it to this. The cheap next shot. So as I mentioned before, this idea of inviting me and you and everyone we know into creating their first game is a market-tested one that's sort of proven itself out. When a sculpture student from Japan comes in and from nowhere gives us this, or when a multimedia studio artist is invited by Nintendo to create something for their new touchscreen device and we end up getting this, or when an Osaka DJ and graphic designer gets a shot at creating something for the PlayStation 3, every time this happens, it widens the audience for games in the least cynical way and brings the whole medium forward with it. It makes people say, or at least has made people say to me, I didn't know video games could do this. That's exactly what we want. So this is essentially what I mean by all play is personal. It's something that Introversion understood very early on in the new indie movement timeline, that existing and creating under your own auspices also means that the player needs to feel the you inside your game, right down to cultivating something of a rock band mythos to the studio itself. Here we have Chris as the creative type, and Mark as the front man, and Tom as the business one, and John as the tech. It's something that every one of the people that I mentioned in that brief history before has understood. And it's what people respond to even if they're not fully aware of it. They can feel when your game was something you were burning to create. And look, it's easy for me to say when I don't actually survive by making games myself that if you're not currently working on your passion project within like some reasonable limits, you should start doing that immediately. There's still work that needs to be done on growing a market who wants to take a chance on original ideas, but otherwise I think it's a very good idea. And I don't want any of this to sound naively optimistic about your chances of success. You'll be entering one of the most crowded video game markets video games has ever seen. And your ability to sink or swim depends almost entirely on your originality and wits. So you probably read this recent article with Peter Molyneux saying that the ease with which indie gaming can flourish on these new platforms is limited. And there's a sense to which he's probably right. The massive studios and corporate developers have you against the ropes from so many angles. They're always going to be able to outspend you exponentially with budgets as high as like $50 to $60 million. They're always going to be able to outmarket you and strike deals with platform holders that you aren't going to be able to get. And more importantly, they're always going to have fewer scruples than you. As faceless product churning machines without the personal behind them, they can wantonly borrow entire other franchises, and they can outright lift the best ideas laid down by those that came before them. And they'll get away with it too, because the pesky, super sleuthing kids just aren't there with enough force in the mainstream media to call them out. And so in the same way that I think I've only been given the opportunities that I've had because I've brought that same obsessive energy to unearth and catalog everything that you're creating, by the same token, by saying all play is personal, I mean that by far your best chance of survival is to give the world exactly what it is the monolithic industry doesn't have, your personal expression. So why do I say that leaving games was the best thing I ever did? It's because it ended up being an unexpected vision quest that showed me the true artistic potential and value of our medium, rather than seeing it endlessly stuck recycling its own tropes. In almost every respect, the indie game scene is the new punk movement. And there exists outside of games a huge variety of influences we could be drawing upon with simply art. I'd like to play just a few inspirational clips here to explain what I mean, things that could so easily be a direction we could be headed in, or at least spaces we could be exploring aesthetically if we weren't so mired in our past. This first one's a really tiny short little film called Return as an Animal by Bruno De Colo that expresses exactly that mystery and that magic that I mentioned earlier. So this next one is called Vanishing Point by Takayuki Hosogane. It's a world of color and shape and sound. It's exactly the same component parts that we deal with in games, but it's a world that I desperately want to play in. So, it's true that while we have had some flirtations with mainstream success, we haven't quite hit that critical mass point where people realize that there's a legitimate underground totally worth paying attention to. And even within the community, there's still not the understanding and support that everyone in the act of creation knows that we rightfully deserve. While film, and especially music, may have worked out over the past few decades how to support its fringes and its underground, gaming is still stuck at the point of the radio hit, or of broadcast TV, where people are led by the nose to the games with the biggest ad budgets, not because they're necessarily fulfilled by what they're spoon-fed, but because they simply don't know that there's anything else out there. We're still treating games simply like products, like hairspray or deodorant. Your creative expression is still just an entertainment commodity, like pop songs. People haven't been trained yet to understand the process or the potential. The concept to retail shelf process to most people is still just like magic. But I think that's slowly changing, and I truly believe that we can accelerate the process by showing the wider public that games can do more than they ever thought was possible. What we should want is for people to remember that time in their life when they played and so deeply identified with your game that it became a part of them in the same way as their favorite albums have in the past. Everyone in this audience can help change it by being the cultural force that helps a new generation of people shed their video game shame. And this concept of personal play is gaining traction. This quote from Cactus popped up a few days after I had started this talk, That there are no games that try to convey messages or personal views on life and